Howdy! Today I'm going to be talking about the 1947 science fiction novel from Rafael Bernal. His name was Death. This book satisfied my book club's monthly reading prompt, this month being a book featuring a plant or a flower on the cover. And as you can see, the fecund jungle, which is the primary setting of this book, fulfilled that prompt handily. The premise for this book is one of the most batshit I have ever heard of. After I have told you what this book is about, if it doesn't sound interesting to you, I don't want to know you. Rafael Bernal was a deeply Catholic Mexican writer who at the time had supported a number of failed revolutionary causes, someone who sought to bring about radical change in line with their deeply held religious beliefs and ultimately failed, resulting in a sort of misanthropic bitterness. His Name Was Death follows a nameless protagonist, someone who has left a journal behind accounting the events of the story after they have transpired. A misanthropic, bitter, old drunk as he recoils from society to flee into the jungle and live among the indigenous people there, the Lacandan, going on a number of binges early on in the story to drown his failures, these regrets that he won't ever properly explain, but he alludes to constantly, that the world has left him scorned, has hurt him. After one particularly gnarly binge where he goes around the jungle raving and lashing out at the vines without a machete, using his teeth to gnash away the foliage and create a path for himself, he manages to recover from his alcoholism, and the indigenous people almost kind of see him as someone who has had his evil spirits exorcised, and they look to him as something of a spiritual leader within the village. He develops a mutually beneficial relationship with the tribe, though he definitely still exists kind of on his own outside of even this small group of people. All the while, he is being tormented by mosquitoes. He ends up actually developing a skill for killing them, getting so good that he almost like brags to the reader like, I could have killed twice as many mosquitoes as you could have. I got that good at it. He becomes so intimate with the constant swarm of mosquitoes assailing him that he begins to detect subtle nuances in the buzzing of these mosquitoes. He commissions one of the tribe leaders to build him a flute that can replicate the sound of these mosquitoes. And here is where the story breaks wide open and becomes one of the craziest books I have ever read. Before I go into it too far, just read this book. It fucking rules. He is able to communicate with the mosquitoes, initially apologizing for having killed so many of their members, to which they reply, "Death does not matter," which should alarm you right away. He terms the new language that he has crafted to communicate with the mosquito civilization mosquito. You're going to just simply need to buy into the premise of the book, because once he develops the language, the book is written as if he's having just verbal conversations with the mosquitoes. While that does demand a slight suspension of disbelief, it is actually such an easy concession to make given how fluid the writing is in this book. Let me hold it up for you. This is like 140 pages or so, and the economy of the writing compacts its story in such a way that you leave feeling totally satisfied with how everything played out. I think the telltale sign of a good book is one that leaves you hungry to read more. Reading being an activity that is conscious and takes work. One that incentivizes you to do more of that is a sign that this one's a keeper. While the development of a whole language certainly would take a lot more time, and some of the words that he uses with the mosquitoes would require very particular context, how he even developed that term and was able to recognize that word from a mosquito, how it ever even came up in conversation for him to parse its meaning. You very quickly buy into this idea that he is the one person who can talk to mosquitoes, and he is probably the worst person to have taken on this role because he ends up siding with the mosquito civilization, plotting the downfall of mankind. Out of all of the creatures Bernal could have zeroed in on to signify the other in this scenario, that he uses mosquitoes. Creatures that I think are widely hated by pretty much everyone. And so our animosity toward them is natural going into the story. While the civilization of mosquitoes reflects a different hierarchical system than our own, clearly an analog for communism, I would say, and thus Bernal is able to lob his criticisms at that system through this metaphor. As you get deeper into the narrative, the thing is, the mosquitoes have pathos. They are beings that have kind of been conditioned to observe the natural order of mosquito civilization that has endured for millions of years. And there exists within this system a subjugated laborer class exploited by the High Council, whose name is never to be spoken. They can't even put a name to the entity that oppresses them. Unconcerned with the death of its own population and the death of other species on the planet, they do serve as foils to mankind and sometimes even parallel our own internal conflicts. While that power is very alluring to him at first, being propped up as like the most powerful human in the world by siding with the mosquitoes, the protagonist kind of comes to realize he has simply traded one master for another. Freedom, to me, is the prime virtue Bernal props up in this novel, illustrated very clearly in how he weaves his religious beliefs into the text. Something that initially struck me as kind of silly, given I'm not a religious person, and there are plot points like the mosquitoes knowing about the existence of God and keeping that knowledge from the lower caste. It does work towards Bernal's ultimate statement. While it might not be belief in God for you and I, it can simply be the belief generally. We are independent and free creatures, and we all have our own will, and we're all equal. But where this novel offers great food for thought is that it is not a simple condemnation of the system of communism. It also is critical of Bernal's own sort of like libertarian philosophy, where it estranges you from mankind and where your motivations are so self-serving that you ignore your humanity, like the protagonist of this book, who is an interesting and unreliable sort of narrator, initially desiring, after expelling the alcoholism from his system, to establish a mission in the jungle. His lust for power at the thought of him being able to enslave and subjugate other people. It's very obviously like the mentality of a poisoned individual. Someone whose sense of like personal injustice has completely clouded their perspective on what is ultimately good. While the protagonist's voicing of this discontent does cut deep, and part of it does resonate, ultimately the protagonist betrays their good intentions at the start of the novel, or good in the context of how he would frame them, because I don't believe bringing a mission to the native peoples is truly the right thing. The notion of colonization is also permeated throughout this whole novel. The protagonist is offered a counterpoint to the life that he lived, a peaceful existence with these tribes where he has a role, he is valued, and after having lived that, now with the promise of some great power at the expense of destroying the world effectively, he chooses the latter. And so I believe that the kind of freedom that Bernal really prizes is the sort of divine freedom that his religious beliefs grants all of mankind, that everyone is sort of existentially equal. But I think he is also critical of this sort of self-serving, almost like Luciferian pursuit of greatness that comes at the expense of all of mankind. It's a very, very interesting sort of dialectic going on throughout the whole book, the clash between individualism and collectivism, the alluring quality of both of these systems, but also the pratfalls of them, the efficiency of the mosquito civilization coming at the expense of millions and millions of its members and their own autonomy, and the pursuit of freedom offering a balm for the protagonist to truly pursue something that gives him a sense of meaning, taken to such self-serving ends, ultimately sabotages him and leads to violent catastrophe. A group of scientists have gone into the jungle to try to record the music of the Lacandons and have discovered this plot to overthrow mankind with the aid of the mosquitoes, which the protagonist effectively now wields like a weapon. That he does not realize that he is using the mosquitoes the way that human civilization used him up, that he's unable to actually see the damage that he is doing to the mosquito civilization through his own actions. It's brilliant. One of the professors, knowing what the protagonist is going to do, with tears in his eyes, declares that he is going to kill the protagonist. He knows murder is wrong, but it is like his duty to stop him in like a grand cosmic sense, and that he takes pain in what he must do. It's this really noble moment, and that he actually telegraphs it ultimately spells his demise. The threat that the mosquitoes present chills me and gives this book a truly horrific quality. This would be a great October read. Not only do the mosquitoes outnumber us, have us beat in terms of sheer coordination, they have actually been secretly incubating diseases for a long time, something of like a biological nuke. And having just lived through a pandemic, maybe this book wouldn't have hit so hard 6 years ago, but it certainly has a different color to it now. The way that the mosquitoes speak is also very chilling. It's very mechanical. Barring the interactions that the protagonist has with the suppliers, members of the mosquito cast that are higher up, they just seem to sort of carry the sentiment of the overall High Council. When a mosquito dies, it's replaced by another member who is almost like exactly the same. They feel like automatons until the very end of the story, where the suppliers have this kind of like Plato's allegory of the cave moment where they realize that freedom exists as a concept. The callous way that the mosquitoes speak of mankind, that there will just be this group of people farmed constantly, that all art, any aspect of human civilization essentially, that does not function as like pure utility is to be done away with. It strikes you as very alien and cold and brutally efficient. On the note of art, it is music that facilitates the dialogue between mankind and the mosquitoes to begin with. And it is that the scientists come not to subjugate the indigenous people, but to just simply understand them and record their art. While there is certainly an undertone of colonization to their presence, it definitely rings as more pure of an intention than the protagonist. Art within the realm of writing, too, is interesting because the protagonist still has dreams of living on in the book that he is written, as a way for him to extend himself. It's an unabashed account of his self-serving evil deeds. He acknowledges what he did, but he's not trying to apologize for it. Another sort of duality, like the pure motivation behind art as a way to communicate with other people and understand each other more, and then art as a sort of tool for immortality. The commentary in this book is just so layered. Its concepts and the parallels between them are numerous, despite it being so short. A pretty prominent theme is that of mankind's negative ecological impact, it being a partial motivation for the mosquitoes waging war on mankind, for they have like encroached upon mosquito civilization through their activity. I think the highest compliment I can give to this book, while it doesn't really quite come to the same grandeur, is that this book reminded me of the Chimera Ant arc from Hunter x Hunter. The notion of power, what species deserve dominance over this planet and dominion over all of its creatures. It offers so many lofty themes for me to chew on while also being a super gnarly narrative. There's some really gut-wrenching scenes in this book that outline the mosquitoes' willingness to do anything to achieve their goal. Like how the main character has to offer blood rituals to the mosquitoes in order to now compensate for the blood that they will lack in refraining from biting him and the native people, him setting upon a wild deer and wounding it with an arrow, keeping it alive so that it can continue to bleed for the mosquitoes to send their suppliers in, and then eventually the wound on the deer like coagulates and starts to heal, and he has to injure it again, and the whole time Bernal describes it as screaming with human pathos. My father is a hunter, and I have a distinct memory when I was a younger kid, him getting a deer in the backyard, and I couldn't even get up next to it to pose for a photo. I couldn't touch it. I didn't want to be near it. I was too sad. I understand the necessity of hunters to weed the deer population so it doesn't get out of control, but I'm just not that guy. I can't be that guy. It makes me too upset. Or the manner in which the mosquitoes end up testing their incubated diseases to see if they actually work, if they can actually kill a person. and they can. This directly relating to another idea that Bernal presents us with, or at least a quality of the protagonist that may or may not be his whole driving factor, and it is his lovelessness. The person he decides to sick the mosquitoes on is someone who is going out with this woman, Miss Jones. The main character develops feelings for her, or at least a bothersome attraction that clearly influences his decision to pick the man that she's going out with as their test subject, effectively murdering this guy out of a sense of possessiveness of Miss Jones, out of a sense that he deserves her, or that her even being in his presence has scorned him. I know I talked about this in Confederacy of Dunces, but man, does he feel like a proto-incel kind of character. Someone whose lack of romantic success curdled him into a really nasty person. Someone who feels entitled. This ultimately spirals into probably the most ironic moment of the novel, which I will save for you to discover, but it relates to Miss Jones, the protagonist trying to kind of make up for what he's done too late. A really dark and fitting end for him. I'm amazed that this isn't celebrated even a little bit more than it is. This is a stone cold science fiction classic with a lot to say, a super cool premise, and just a really riveting story to boot. Get through it in like a single day if you can, because it is that readable, it is that short, it is that worth your time. One signature I attribute to my favorite works of art is that they can only exist, at least in their ultimate and most realized form, within their particular medium. That a film succeeds precisely because it is a film, that it utilizes cinematic language to achieve its full powers, that could not be felt if this same story as a film were transcribed into a book or was adapted into like a concept album or anything like that. And I think that that applies to every single medium. And His Name Was Death, just due to its particular strangeness and how silly it would be, I'm sure, to see a man playing a flute and a mosquito buzzing next to him and us getting like subtitles to account their interaction, just how much that would register as unrealistic. That it is able to work in this medium is testament, I think, to how great it is. That this is a story that could only really work on the written page because it is so bonkers. Absolutely pick this one up if you can find it. I had to get it through Interloan. If I can ever get a physical copy to keep someday, I want to. It's definitely worthy of the bookshelf. Yeah, that's about all I've got today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.